Hi, Misha here, and I have a couple of new Panavia Tornado models. So I thought let's do a big video looking at these again. Why not? And the variations. The only hobby master, since I'm only looking at the British ones, is this GR.1 over here, circa around 1983, so around its introduction of service. Yeah, GR.1 Ground Attack Reconnaissance. Next to it is another early one. This is the Corgi. This was a GR.1P. Originally would have been a GR.1A, which was originally meant to be a reconnaissance version. And then we have the F.3. This is the Fighter Interceptor Mark III. This is an early version. And next we have a GR.1 from Operation Granby, Desert Storm, 1991, Iraq. Kitted out with smart bombs. And then we have another F.3. This is a later version one with updated armament and avionics from the 21st century. And then finally we have a GR.4 from, I believe it was the 2011 time frame. Again, kind of modernized and with kind of a modern targeting pod and avionics and weapons. So yeah, we'll look at this aircraft's service in all forms and these various models, all 1/72 scale diecast. Beginning with the Hobby Master here. This was their first release for the RAF, and it is of a GR.1 circa 1983, which was really when these were coming online. Not to make this a long video, but the Panavia Tornado has a very interesting beginning in the 1960s. The original idea actually didn't involve the UK, but it was several other European nations. The UK would come in 1968 after several failed attempts at a modern strike aircraft. Originally they tried partnering with France, then they tried the F-111 with America. Once all these things ended up failing, they were involved, but France would draw Belgium away. But in 1969, the company Panavia was established, with the UK and Germany being the principal backers, but also the Netherlands and Italy still interested. Canada did entertain the notion, but decided it didn't meet their needs. And likewise, in 1970, the Netherlands backed out because the aircraft that was emerging just wasn't the affordable, simple, maneuverable aircraft that they wanted, thus leaving Germany, the UK, and Italy. Nevertheless, production on the prototype began. The next decision was 1-seat or 2-seat. A 2-seat design was selected, and a prototype was built. In 1974, it flew for the first time, and overall, testing went well. The UK and Germany put in their initial production orders in 1976, and the first production aircraft flew in 1979, and the first deliveries to the RAF and West German Luftwaffe would commence later that year. Italy would get their first ones in 1981. Also in 81, a joint training facility was set up in the UK. This would train pilots from all nations. And then in 1982, the RAF would start to distribute these to squadrons, with the first one coming online in June of that year, becoming the first Tornado squadron in the world. And by 1983, when this aircraft is modeled, the UK had 3 squadrons. And the Tornado was meant to be multi-role from the beginning, but its primary role was as a low-level strike aircraft, either nuclear or conventional. So it came in low and fast and would drop ordnance and hopefully get out of Dodge. Secondary roles included maritime, anti-shipping, and patrol, and other variants would soon come. And it was a modern aircraft for its day. It had a digital bus, at least in part. 2-seat cockpit, of course. It had variable geometry wings, which could go from 25 all the way up to nearly 70 degrees sweep. Full out would give it good short runway takeoff and landing, and also very fuel efficient performance. Swept back would give it speed and just overall performance. This was good for dashes. One thing to point out, this was not designed especially for maneuverability and agility. It was designed for raw speed. It was capable of Mach 2.2 at altitude, but it was mostly meant for straight line. It did have a terrain following radar and systems for operating, again, at low altitudes. The idea was European forests and whatnot, mountains, to come in low and use trees and whatnot as cover against the Russians if war were ever to come out. It had 2 27mm cannon, and it could carry nearly 20,000 pounds of ordnance. It had 3 heavy hardpoints under the fuselage, and each wing had 2 rotating hardpoints. And it was pretty much cleared to carry any NATO air-to-surface weapons, and it could carry air-to-air missiles, beginning with the AIM-9 Sidewinder for defense. But it was not designed as a dogfighter. Now, this is the first variant known as the IDS, or adopted as the GR.1. In service, it replaced some Buccaneer and Jaguar squadrons, but not all of them. The UK ordered 228 GR.1s, and production went pretty smoothly, with the 500th Tornado delivered to the Luftwaffe in 1987. And once the initial strike roll was met, variants began to appear. So let's talk about a few of them. Here we have the GR.1P from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE. This is an interesting aircraft with an interesting history. Initially, the RAF ordered 23 dual-control trainers known as the GR.1T. And this is what this was created as. In fact, it was an early production one, like the 8th Tornado off the production line. But during ground test, it suffered a fire, having the whole rear gutted, and it was no longer suitable for military service. Nevertheless, Panavia would restore it. A little stiff here. And that's why it would end up at the, notice the tailplane moves. It would end up at the Royal Aircraft Establishment for trials and testing purposes. And because of its interesting position and equipment loadout, it was designated as the GR.1P. And funnily enough, it would end up being the last GR.1 flying in the world. And it was finally retired. I don't know, this one's, kind of a clean version. More of a glossy paint scheme. I like it too because it has pretty stiff wings. Some of the Corgis are floppy. It does come with empty pylons and drop tanks if you want to do that, but I thought I'd keep one of mine kind of in a stripped down configuration. Something else to point out, when I did the video on the Hobby Master, which is new, some thought that the tail fin and the cockpit were the wrong shape. I think they said that the cockpit was too large and the tail fin was just the wrong shape. But looking at this other GR.1 from Corgi, I don't really see it. But maybe I'm wrong. The tail looks the same shape to me, and the cockpit, I don't know, seems the same to me. Certainly not noticeably smaller. But that's just me. Other variants. Well, we have the GR.1A, which was the photo reconnaissance variants. They would have 30 of those, 14 conversions from standard GR.1, and 16 new builds. And essentially that replaced the cannon up front, which this one doesn't have cannon, with something similar to what this does have, which is a pod for taking pictures, known as the TIRRS, which was essentially a tornado infrared reconnaissance system. And that was for the GR.1A. And this was a low-level photographic reconnaissance setup. And of course, the GR.1As were not typically armed, they just carried this system. Another variant was the GR.1B, which, as far as I know, were all conversions. These were for maritime anti-shipping strike and reconnaissance. 26 would be converted to carry the new Sea Eagle missile when it was adopted around 1985, which was an update of the old Martel missile. And so these would replace the good old Blackburn Buccaneer S2 in the maritime strike role. Although some people preferred the old Buccaneer to the new Tornado. They would also eventually get updated radar that worked better for the maritime role, but this would come in the 90s. By the way, the maximum altitude of this aircraft is about 50,000 feet, because again, it was meant for low level, at least in the beginning. So we had the GR.1T, the GR.1A, and the GR.1B. These were all designed for kind of variations on the original ground attack role, and were essentially the exact same aircraft, but with slightly different avionics and different accessories under the wings and fuselage. But the next variant to come out was a much more radical change. Meet the Tornado ADV, Air Defense variant. Also one of my new models I picked up during the Aikens Christmas sale because, I don't know, thought it was neat. This is a specialized interceptor, but it's not a dogfighter. Now, when the UK joined the whole program that would result in the Tornado, they needed a new strike fighter, but they also needed a new interceptor to defend against Soviet bombers and similar threats. They tried pushing the other members, but Germany and Italy didn't need such a thing. So eventually, after the GR.1, the IDS, I should say, had flown and was getting into production, in 1976, approval was given to develop the ADV in the UK. Now, this was them pretty much going alone. And they based it off the IDS, but they would give it a new nose and other changes. 3 prototypes were ordered, the first of which flew in 1979, and the other 2 in 1980. But it would not be until 1984 that the first version would fly, which was known as the F.3, very similar to this here. But one of the key pieces of tech that was going to be in the ADV was an advanced air-to-air combat radar, but it wasn't ready. So the F.2, instead of having a radar in the front, had concrete as ballast. The F.2 could carry 4 Sky Flash missiles, medium range, the same ones used by the F.2 Phantom and the F.4 Phantom. You know, basically Sparrow missiles, AIM-7. It could carry up to 4 under the body, and it can carry, the F.2 could carry 2, 1 on each wing, AIM-9 Sidewinders for short ranged events with optional fuel tanks for extended range. It used the same Mark 103 engines as the GR.1 back here, but it did remove one of the cannon and replaced it with a refueling probe. They would build 18 F.2s, and the first squad was operational in 1987, but already before that, the F.3, the one we see here, first flew at the end of 1985. And the F.3 would be the first to have the operational radar, and they made several other important improvements. By this time, it has a new set of displays for the cockpit to better meet the needs of such pilots. It had a new computer system. It's worth pointing out that the earlier GR1s had manually adjustable wings. The ADV variant had automatically adjustable wings. They also had more of a sweep. They could go anywhere from 67% or degree down to 25, meaning the span was from 46 down to 28 feet. To house the new radar, it has a longer nose. Overall length of an ADV is a little over 61 feet versus just under 55 feet for the GR1. Top speed is still Mach 2.2. Max altitude is still 50,000 feet. But with the F.3, they went to the new Mark 104 engines, which were designed specifically for high altitude performance. Better climb, better thrust, better fuel efficiency, things of that nature. And this is the one that was really firstly declared combat capable. The first F.3 squads were ready by 1988, 1989. And they thought about updating the older F.2s, but they decided just to keep the 18 they had. It wasn't really worth the effort for training, and just keep them in reserve. Eventually, they would just put them in mothballs. They would order 147 of the F.3s. Oh, one other thing. With the F.3, they went from being able to carry 2 Sidewinders to 4. They made a double launch rail, one on each side of the fuel tank, and again, the fuel tank is optional. So, did turning a strike aircraft into more of an interceptor work? The jury may be still out on that. Again, these were not all that agile or maneuverable, even with this variant. So they were not dogfighters. Also, at higher altitudes, say 40,000 feet, they really had to chew up some fuel, use their afterburners. They really were more comfortable around 25,000 feet. Still high, but yeah. And it's a big aircraft. Some have called it lumbering, so it didn't quite handle like some would want a fighter to do. But it wasn't designed to be a fighter. It was designed to intercept bombers. So some good things. Its radar system was actually quite advanced for the 1980s, even though it took quite a while to finally come out. And its missiles were very good. It used the more modern versions of the Sidewinder, and the Skyflash was their version, which was actually an improvement on the AIM-7 Sparrow. And it could carry up to 8 missiles plus 2 drop tanks. So it had a good armament, and it still had a cannon too. And those drop tanks, plus the internal fuel and the new engines that were more efficient, meant it had very good range or endurance for what it was. This is good because one of the aircraft that the RAF was hoping to replace was the old English Electric Lightning. One, I really like, but range, endurance, and for that matter, weaponry, it was not. So compared to the Lightning, they really did get quite a bit more out of their aircraft. They went from 2 missiles up to 8, and the range endurance was multiplied exponentially. And you have a crew of 2, which is always easier to handle radar with. Production would last until 1993, so pretty, short run. But that's because only the RAF really wanted this. Although later a couple of other nations would order these in limited numbers. We'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, this replaced first the Lightning, and then later it replaced quite a few British Phantoms to be their interceptor. And one good thing, it was very much parts compatible with the GR.1, the IDS model. In fact, as many as 80% of the parts were the same. Really, the difference was mostly in the nose. The ADV was not cleared to use air-to-surface weapons. This was an air-to-air only, kind of like the Tomcat or the F.15 of the day. So yeah, by 1990, which is when this model is supposed to be from, these were in active squadron service, and really their first combat tour would come with Operation Granby, when 18 would be sent to the Gulf. But since these were new aircraft and a new design, they were kind of put on second string duty, kind of held back from the front lines, just making sure no Iraqi MiGs snuck through. To that end, the ADV, while it made patrols in Iraq, and while it would actually stay in theater to enforce the no-fly zones throughout 92, 93, and onward, it saw no combat in 1991. However, the GR.1 certainly did. This is the other new one, and unlike the ADV we just looked at, that model you can still readily get. This one has been out of print for quite a while, but was one that the Aikens found in the back. And I have a hard time resisting getting Gulf War era aircraft. Just think they're neat. Whereas the F.3 was new, so it was kind of given a secondary role during the Gulf War, the GR.1 was very much in service. It had been around for almost a decade. It was tested, it was tried, its squadrons were trained up, so it came in. And these worked alongside the Jaguar and the Blackburn Buccaneer, which used its laser designating pod to help direct Tornadoes and Jaguars. And this one here has 2 penetration bombs to hit airfields and punch craters in the runways. It also has 2 fuel tanks, and like the original F.2, the GR.1 carried only 1 missile with the tank for self-defense. It also had ECM pods on the wings, and of course these also carried chaff and flare for defense. Now, the Tornado was designed for a low altitude strike. Sure, nuclear was its potential use to go behind enemy lines and hit a target, but of course conventional ordnance was always thought in. So in Iraq, they came in low and fast and hit targets, sometimes as low as 50 feet. The problem is they didn't have much cover. In the desert, you have no trees, and not everywhere has mountains. And that low, you do also encounter a lot of sand and dust. And this made them somewhat vulnerable, not so much to SAMs, but ground fire, anything. I mean, the aircraft is reasonably well armored for what it was, but it's still an aircraft. 60 tornadoes would serve in the Gulf War. And honestly, I don't know if that counts the 18 ADVs or if that is 60 IDSs alone. And they did hit their target, and they did very well. But no Jaguars or Buccaneers were lost, but 6 tornadoes were lost in that war. And this was just kind of due in part to their low-level profile, some to do with the new technology, and also just that they were sent in for some very dangerous and important missions. So they were successful, but they did note some things that maybe weren't such a good idea or could be improved upon. But yeah, this has the very unique Operation Granby paint scheme. It's pretty much the same as the Hobbymaster over here, although the Hobbymaster has different ordnance. It is really neat. It has moving wings and, the same features, but the only bad thing about any of these Hobbymaster or Corgi, the swing wing designs, the pylons that rotate are never, the ordnance doesn't hold on as good as you would like. I kind of wish both companies had found a better solution, frankly. It's just hard to rotate it with the wings. And then half the time, like these big tanks, there's just so much weight, it's hard for them to stick on because they're having to rely on one single round peg. Whereas most other things either have 2 pegs or even a slot like on the Hobbymaster. But it's kind of just the limitation of the design. Oh, one thing to point out that I didn't mention, you notice that the GR.1 has 1 pylon under each wing. 2 pylons under each wing. The ADV only had 1 pylon. They didn't have the outboard pylons on the wings. I mean, probably physically they did, since they used a very similar wing to the GR.1, but the outer pylon was not wired up, plumbed, or ready to go for anything. They only used the 2 inboard, which makes sense for the interceptor role. I mean, if it could carry a tank and 2 defensive missiles on the pylon, that's enough as far as weight goes. So yeah, both the GR.1 and the F.3 served in Desert Storm. But that would lead to the next generation, kind of a midlife update of the Tornado. The GR.4. After the Gulf War, in 1994, it was decided to alter the Tornado's mission profile from low-level to medium-level operations. This is because the enemy had changed, the missions were different, and honestly, the defenses the aircraft was going up against were different. And at the beginning of 1997, the first prototype of these modified aircraft would fly. And between that year and 2003, 142 remanufactured GR.1s would come back to the RAF as GR.4s. So in a general sense, the difference was from low to medium altitude. Of course, specifically, this would require a number of changes, which honestly you can read about. I don't want to go too deep into them because I'm not that expert on that stuff. But some included a new GPS system, and it did replace one of the two Canon with a new forward-looking infrared radar system. They had new cockpit displays, updated avionics and computers, and the GR.4 was compatible with night vision goggles and a whole host of new ordnance, including JDAM and other guided munitions, and it could accept new targeting pods as well as defensive systems. So kind of what you'd expect, and similar to what the Jaguar would receive going to the Mark III version of it. And these were ready in time for the Second Iraq War, which they served in, as well as Afghanistan. And they would receive further improvements over time, including a new data link. And they weren't sure how long the Tornado would continue to serve. At first it was thought maybe till 2025. But then in 2009, because of the budget, the RAF was going to have to either cut the Tornado, the Tonka as it was referred to by this point, or the Harrier. So one of the two was getting cut. And as it turns out, it was the Harrier. So the Tornado was continued to be improved throughout. There was another program in 2013. It took over, of course, the Harrier's roles. And this one here is from 2011 with the Libya campaign, in which these flew very long-range bombing missions. It also features in the back here Britain's new Brimstone anti-armor missile. These were kind of a three-pack inspired by the American Hellfire, but really an improvement. So they usually would carry 3 on one point, and it was a very efficient use of space. This one also has the targeting pod here, and then two bombs. It also has improved, modernized missiles for defense. These are the AIM-132 ASRAAM, which is like a modern American Sidewinder, but it's kind of the European take on that. I believe Germany also uses them. So you're starting to see some new ordnance. Externally, the differences are in the details with antenna. And again, these were all remanufactured GR1s. The last Tornadoes would come off the production line in 1998, and these would actually go to Saudi Arabia, who was the only export customer. Back in the 80s, Germany did not want to export the fighter bomber, but finally they acquiesced, and so Panavia began to kind of advertise. But the only taker was Saudi Arabia. And they too would update their IDS to this kind of GR.4 standard. And we had the GR.1A, we talked about the reconnaissance variant, and it too was updated to the GR.4A, but its old TERS system was no longer applicable. It was designed for low-level reconnaissance, so with the GR.4A operating at medium altitude, they would start using external reconnaissance pods of different types. And they would get all the other avionics and navigation and eventually cockpit displays and what have you as the standard GR4. But the differences between the two became less pronounced, more to do with the pods. And the GR4A program would be a little bit later than the original GR4, just based on the assets that the UK had. So they started to replace these around 2014 with some Eurofighter Typhoons that had finally started to come online, and then later some of the F.35 Lightnings again finally came available, and these help kind of scale back the Tornado fleet, which to be fair is kind of aging at this point, but still viable. So much so that they were using these in 2018 in the Syrian conflict to attack rebel insurgent positions. But by this point, most squads had transitioned away from the Tornado or had just disbanded altogether. Nevertheless, these did see combat missions up through January 23rd, 2019. That was the last time the GR.4 fleet was used in anger. Following that, they had a few final ceremonial flights in March, and it was officially retired from the RAF on April 1st, 2019, thus ending a 40-year career. Not too shabby, frankly. But that's the IDS version. What about the ADV? So when we last talked about the ADV, it was helping enforce no-fly zones in the Middle East against Iraq. Also in 1992, 4 were stationed in the Falklands, replacing older Phantoms there. And this contingent was obviously in place because of the 1982 war. And this model here is one of those Falklands Defender ADVs. But this is one of the updated ones. In 93 through 95, the ADV was used as an escort fighter over Bosnia, and afterwards in 1996, they had a program called the CSP that it basically was to extend the service life, much as they had done with the GR.1, GR.4 program, and the idea was to keep these operational in 2010 when they could be replaced by the Eurofighter and some be replaced by the F.35. And they would conduct a similar series of updates. They would give them new cockpit displays, updated computer systems, and they would give compatibility with new weapons, including the new AIM 120. It could carry 4 under the fuselage there. Sorry, this one on this side doesn't like to stay on. In the little recessings. It is one difference with the ADV versus the IDS. It has recessed or semi-recessed hardpoints, much like a Phantom. And so yeah, they would carry the AIM 120. Although it must be said, it wasn't until around 2001 that the radar was updated to the point that it could take full advantage of the more modern missile. So there would ultimately be updates to the radar. It would also get more modern navigation systems and so on and so forth. And then still yet later, they would be updated to take the AIM 132 ASROM that we already talked about on the GR.4. Again, able to carry 2 of them under each wing. So yeah, just an update of the weapons and instruments and what have you. These were sent to Iraq carry out air patrols in 2003. But actually they were sent home that same year, not because they weren't useful, but because they simply found no credible threats. Some ADVs were even updated to be capable of using anti-radiation missiles and used in the SEAD role, suppression of enemy air defense. This would be the first time this variant could launch a air-to-surface piece of ordnance. They didn't really receive a new designation, the ones that have been updated, although some places refer to them unofficially as the F.3. And there were a few other updates besides. But finally, the Typhoon is starting to come online. And so they're able to start kind of drawing these down. By 2009, there's only really one full squadron of ADVs and maybe the 4 in the Falklands, although they would soon be replaced by Typhoons too. And then in early 2011, the last Tornado F.3 squadron is retired. So they made it to that 2010 mark and a little bit further besides. Now, Italy would actually lease 24 of these from the UK. This was originally signed in 93 with deliveries in 95 through 97. And these are to replace the aging F-104 Starfighter, and because the Eurofighter Typhoon didn't look to be coming any day soon. The lease was over, and the last ones were returned in 2004, and Italy still wasn't hopeful about getting Typhoons, so they would have another lease for F-16s from the USA. So the ADV would actually be reflown by Italy, who originally had no interest in it, just because of delays in aging airframes for their own interceptors. Like I said, Saudi Arabia, I know had some of the IDSs. I feel like they might have acquired some of the ADVs as well. Let me know in the comments. I didn't really check. I was just kind of focusing on the RAF. But I do know that West Germany, later Germany, did not operate this variant. Although West Germany, Germany, and Italy did operate a variant that the UK did not. The electronic variant for electronic warfare. But the RAF had other aircraft for that role. So yeah, by 2012, the interceptor mission was taken over by the new Eurofighter Typhoon. And still yet later on, places like the Falklands, you might see the F-35. You know, the RAF was changing, the Harrier was out of service. Kind of an interesting thing. And there we have it, guys. Ironically, this was my first Corgi Tornado, even though we're talking about it last. So, what's my reason behind having these models? So with that, yeah, my reasoning. I mean, to be fair, I have this one because it was my first. It was at Pete's Collectibles. He had a few. It was a good price. And really, when I bought it, I didn't understand just how different the IDS and ADV variants were. But I liked it. I liked the Falklands connection. But after I realized the GR.1 so different, just kind of felt like I had to get one. And the Libyan connections seemed interesting. And when I got it in, I was really happy with all the ground attack ordnance it came with. And generally speaking, that was what I had for a while. But I really wanted a GR.1. At that time, Hobbymaster had not released any. They hadn't even announced them. And Corgi didn't really have any available. So I found this one at Aikens and thought, normally I don't go for the RAE planes, but I like the fact that it started off as a trainer and the history behind it, and thought, well, it is a GR1 in an early production, early block at that, and I got it actually just before Christmas of last year. Not 2020, but 2019. And I like it. It's neat. And again, it's nice to have one I can just display in clean mode. And this was the last flying GR1 because after they went to the GR.4 program, the remaining GR1 airframes were usually high mileage ones, and they were just retired. And I could put the tanks on it, but it is hard to get them to stick on as big as they are. And of course, the Hobbymaster came out, and I was very curious how they did their Tornado. Some have said they actually like the Corgi more, some like the Hobbymaster. I think they did a good job. And I like the fact that it's in an early 80s configuration. And it has just good old iron bombs under the fuselage. And one nice thing about the way they did the model, with some Hobbymasters, you can't put them on the stand and have whatever goes on the belly. But the way they did it, you can. So I'm really happy about that. They have been notified about the cockpit maybe being too big, and William at Hobbymaster said he'd look into that. Again, I really don't think it's oversized, but maybe I'm wrong. Probably I am. Oh well. Following that, didn't really have a need for another one of these, but like I said, this one I picked up at the beginning of Aiken's sale when they found it in the warehouse, because I just have a soft spot for Gulf War aircraft, and it is set up differently than the GR.4, and it has the runway buster bombs here. It didn't come with anything for the rear pylons, which I guess is correct for this role, this mission. And it has the AIM-9s, and then it has the ECM pods on the wing. Pretty neat. But then after getting this, I thought, well, I've got an early and a late ground attack with Sidewinders and Azerams, and I have a late F.3. And this is how a collector's mind works. I have so many GRs and only one F.3. I thought maybe get one more F.3 while the sale was going on. And I kind of looked at the dates and thought, well, this one, where am I at? Yeah, this one should have early equipment, the Sky Flash and the Sidewinder, as opposed to the AIM 120s on my other one. So that's the thing about, well, ordering stuff when you can't see photos. It's a bit of a gamble, but it paid off. This one has the early setup, and there are some differences in the antenna and stuff back here. And of course, it's a different paint scheme. But yeah, this came with the older ordnance, and I think it's nice. The other F.3 I have is a very late flight one, and this one's an early. One thing I noticed is kind of interesting. This F.3, it came with two different pylon options. You can either have it with just the missiles, or there's another set that comes with missiles and tanks together. But with this one, it only came with one set. But what it is, the tanks are not glued to the missiles. So they peg into those that peg into these. So they're not all together. So you can display it with or without the tanks. And I know this wasn't a case of just the glue breaking, because the tanks were actually in a totally separate plastic bag. So I thought that was kind of interesting how they made that minor change in production. This is a much older model. I think this is issue 2 or 3, whereas this is issue like 7 in the collection. I also have the German Tornado from Hobby Master, which is neat in and of itself. But the nice thing about Corgis is they're relatively inexpensive compared with Hobby Masters, about sometimes as much as half the price, so you can afford to pick up some. So which one do you like the best? I mean, they're similar enough, I really, doesn't matter, but yeah. I would have to say probably my favorite. I am very partial to this new F.3. I think it's just because I like interceptors, and it looks really good next to my British Phantom. Oh, one other difference. The missiles, it comes with 4 total, but I only have 2 under it because of the stand, are detachable on this, whereas on this one, the AIM 120s are actually glued in place. I thought that was kind of interesting, too. So you can display this with 1, 2, 3, 4, none of the medium-range missiles under the belly. It's my favorite, I think. The ordnance sticks on well. I like the long nose. The wings are quite tight on this one, tighter than the other one over here. The problem with the GR.4 and GR.1 I noticed is on each of these, one of the holes on the inner pylons was kind of undersized, so I had to go in and carefully remove material. I think it was just paint that kind of went in there. But I guess it's better to be too tight than too loose. It's just hard to get these big old fuel tanks. They're easily knocked and they weigh quite a bit. It's just to get them to hold into one hole. So really why I like these aircraft, they're almost all metal. A good size. They all have opening canopies. I wish Hobby Master and Corgi both would find a better way to do the wings stores. And I could say the same thing for Hobby Master's F.111 aardvarks. They're the same annoyance. But anyway, something to complain about, right? As I've been covering RAF planes, I thought we would look at the Tornado. Let me know what you think. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.